Thank you, Wally. Our next speaker is somebody who's been very involved in the planning issues with, I think, 20 different municipalities around Southern California. He's a municipal planning engineer, and he's going to give his perspective from the standpoint of somebody who's actually in the implementation side of this. Please welcome Robert Righetti.
It's hard to follow up that speech. That was pretty informative. I would just say that, you know, the quote that I have here is probably going to summarize pretty much what he said there, that if we're going to give up our liberties for a little bit of security, then we'd have neither liberty nor safety. And that was the summation of Benjamin Franklin. I'd like you to look at this chart. Tell me what you think about this. This is, I went to a meeting basically where one of the local conservancies was giving a talk about environmentalism and so on, and they had this list on invasive species. And one of the things that struck me was something that appeared on this chart. That's us. Where are the invasive species? The sad part about sustainable development and about environmentalism is that they view humanity as an invasive species. That's a mindset that is basically, it's aimed at destroying everything that we stand for. It's not about preserving us as a species. It's about quarantining us, about pushing us aside into a small little area so that we can be controlled and we're not going to impact the rest of the planet. It's about where you put your priorities in life. And that's basically what summarizes the problem that we're up against, is that we're up against people, a world organization essentially, that views humanity as an invasive species. This is a quote from the American Planning Association's Handbook for Planners. One of the things it notes is that the work of doing or implementing sustainability and sustainable development has to fall on the shoulders of planners, scientists, and community activists. And you might notice at the bottom, it says that with increasing success, proponents of fundamental change are helping to create communities of social and economic structures that are long-lasting on both local and global scales. Worldwide, planners and environmentalists and community activists are taking important steps to advance a concept called sustainability. These are the people who are in the trenches. It's not about those guys in the United Nations. It's not about those people in the White House. It's about the people who are in the trenches implementing this stuff, just like the guys who were marching the Jews into the ovens. If those men had not been there to march those people into the ovens, it wouldn't have mattered what Hitler said. They wouldn't have gone into the ovens. Someone had to do the work. And my problem with the industry that I've been involved with for many, many years is that we have become the useful idiots for a group of people who think I'm an invasive species. The interesting thing, too, is that they recognize that this isn't going to succeed unless we re-educate the entire populace. This is also out of that same manual. Education is critical to the success of any sustainable development program. And so they know that in order to make this thing happen, they have to re-educate you. As I had mentioned earlier in the afternoon program, we don't have to worry about being locked up in re-education camps. We're in it. No prisoners, no bars, none of that stuff. We're simply being re-educated by the slow process of media, the newspapers, movies, the Disney Channel, music, you name it. That's how we're being re-educated. And we're slowly evolving into what they want us to be. Again, as was pointed out by Wally, it's about a focus on outcome. They're more concerned about controlling the outcome of people and controlling how people are equitably distributed as far as their incomes and their race and their mix and all that stuff. They want to control all that. Well, the big question is why? Well, because we're an invasive species. we need to be quarantined. We need to be huddled together and kind of put in their little cubicles and everything so that we can be controlled. This little paragraph was rather interesting. Now, this is out of their handbook for planners as well, and if you notice that little deal on the bottom there about social equity, ecological integrity, and economic prosperity, looks just like the same symbol that's used for Agenda 21. And this is perpetuated essentially through the American Planners Association. But this statement here basically says, for some, sustainability can be achieved by living in compact communities, using public transit, minimizing energy consumption, and recycling waste. For others, it conjures up images of communal living in a small, organic, farm-oriented community with a strong sense of community and surrounded by wide open spaces. Those wide open spaces are the property that we used to occupy. But because we're an invasive species, we need to be put into these little quarantined communities where we're in these high-density developments with high-speed rail to connect us to the other node. That's the idea. And if you really analyze what's going on with the whole planning movement, it's about taking all of us basically who live out in these sprawl areas. That's why they keep making it seem like you're an evil thing to be a part of the sprawl. But to take us out of the rural communities, where you have real culture, where you have neighbors, where people know each other, and huddle you into these tight little communities with a small carbon footprint and no impact. Get you out of your car, put you on a bicycle or on a skateboard or whatever, but interconnect everybody so that you can go to work downstairs in the grocery store or whatever it is that you live above. That's the idea. So it means that now they're pushing us to come to grips with our so-called limitations. Well, what are the limitations? It's land ownership and the rights of private property. That's the target, because that's what prohibits them from really implementing sustainable development in its maximum. As long as people own property and as long as they have rights, they can't do what they want to do. And so they break you down, and they break you down through the planning process. If you go in and submit your application for a development. In fact, I worked on a project in one of the communities near the beach where they had, it was a parcel essentially of around, I'd say probably about 300 acres. But by the time the California Coastal Commission got done with it, it was down to about 40. Because of all of the things that they designated that they couldn't build on. Well, what happened to that guy's property rights? Well, there was nobody there to defend him except for his attorneys and the legal and the experts that he hired. But there were busloads of environmental people who were brought in from all over the country to oppose that project. And there were websites that were opposing that project. Why? Because of this concept. They were buying into the idea that this guy's an invasive species. And the mindset that planners have is that, you know, this is the enemy. I'm working against this guy. But that's one of the things that we have to fight against, that we have to start working back against, because that shouldn't be it. We should be reaching back to those founding principles that made this country great. Again, it's about re-education. And this comes up over and over again when you go through the handbooks and the manuals and the other things that are put out by the different planning organizations. You can go into the bookstores and you look into the ecology section, and it's just row after row of books about the end of the world, about how things are going to fall apart, the earth is going to burn up, the earth is going to freeze, the animals are all going to go away, all of that stuff. But it's the same as the literature over the years of all the millennials groups that said that the end of the world is coming. It's the same rationale. John Ehrlich, who had his book on the population bomb, he's rewritten that thing so many times that it's getting to be where, I mean, what's the point? Because every time he writes it, it's wrong. But he still keeps getting printed. Again, it's about changing our views on things. So that, as it points out here, that it's going to be necessary for us to have that re-education process at the local, national, and global level. This is not just something that's happened in your local community, but it's all over the world. But that re-education process is going on. Now, this is something that you'll find interesting. Back in 1984, there was a very active group called the Planners Network. Planners Network was basically planners that worked in various communities and so on. However, this was a group of planners who were socialist. You'll notice in the second paragraph here, and this is taken from their Planners Network newsletter, that we believe that planning should be a tool for allocating resources and developing the environment to eliminate the great inequalities of wealth and power in our society. That's sustainable development. And when you go to the third paragraph, we oppose the economic structure of our society which values profit and property rights over human rights and needs. These folks worked very hard to get on the boards and worked very hard to rise up in the planning regimes across this country, and took very prominent positions in organizations like the American Planning Association, who certify planners that work all across this country. And so these ideals have been seeded in, and it reflects itself in the way that we see things executed in our projects and in our administration of our cities. It's not just the guys who are passing the legislation, because someone has to implement it. Someone has to put it into place. Here's an interesting guy, E.F. Schumacher. Schumacher wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. And his idea was, you know what? We need to have an appropriate technology that's ecologically suitable and doesn't impact things, and it takes advantage of all the manpower and everything. So his idea was that if you need to dig a hole, a big hole, don't go get a backhoe. Get 25 guys with shovels and put them to work, because that creates jobs. And he wrote a whole bunch of books that, in fact, at one point, I believe it was 1976, or no, that's wrong, it should be 1977 up there when he died. But in 1976, yeah, he didn't live very long. He was 6 years old when he wrote his books. As a typo. But in 1976, he was honored by Congress for his work, and they bought into this stuff. And you can find this stuff online. Who's one of his biggest adherents, one of his biggest followers? I'd like to introduce you to him. He's currently in charge here in the state of California. But he was one of his biggest followers. And he was the first time he came around, the first time he was governor. Still is. This website is an organization that a lot of communities have bought into. Planners are involved in it. Communities are involved in it. Some cities have departments that are essentially operating under this aegis and basically are implementing the programs that this organization pays for. And they pay for the positions in those cities. Why are they doing that? Because they need those planners, they need those people to implement these programs. They're investing in that, in the success of sustainable development, because they want it that bad. And they'll provide the funding to create those departments. This fellow wrote an interesting book called The European Dream. He wrote this back in 2004. One of the focuses of his book was that Europe was going to succeed and be the European dream, and the American dream would disappear because of sustainable development. My question is how's it working now? It's only been, 8 years? And it's almost on fire. So, you know, all of these folks are out there trying to re-educate people, but we shouldn't be paying attention to that. We should be fighting back and trying to do something different, pushing the founding fathers and the founding documents that we had. So essentially, this is the way we should look at it. Now, Ayn Rand, for all the faults and everything else that she had, she did get some things right. And her point was that the ecology movement is a political fraud. Ecologists predict universal doom and demand totalitarian power on the basis of arbitrary hypotheses. And I don't know how many times I have reviewed environmental documents where the word may is used over and over and over again. They will not use the word will, because they know that the minute they do that, they're liable for their statements. And so they will have findings in those documents that basically say, well, if you put this in here, the birds may fly away, or these animals may die, or these weeds may perish. But they never say will, because they don't know. It's all about conjecture. It's all about modeling, and it's about statistics, and statistics and modeling can can lie as much as it can tell you the truth. So it becomes a political tool and a publicity movement to impose their wisdom by force on the rest of mankind. And that's what it's about. And that's what we're seeing today. Thank you.